Well, I'm Jerry Olla. I'm going to be talking to you guys about roaming wars, specifically around how different devices roam. And before I dive into that, little plug that Keith mentioned on the evening events, Hamina is going to be having one of these on Wednesday night. If you scan the QR code, it'll put a little link on your calendar, little appointment on your calendar, so you don't forget about that, and has all the location details and stuff there. But yeah, come stop by. So previously at WLPC, these are kind of my inspiration for this talk, is around these two sessions really stood out to me, and I learned a lot from them. But it also, as a lot of these sessions do, I came away with some more questions. Obviously, they answered a lot of questions and provided a lot of insights, but also got me thinking about other things. So that's what kind of led to this talk about roaming wars and doing some real-world kind of testing. So if you're interested in this particular topic, I would recommend, if you haven't seen these sessions by Wes or Ben Toner, both of those guys are here. Really great talks on this also similar kind of topic around roaming. So here's some of the devices that I tested in these results that I'm going to be going through. I tried to get a pretty wide variety of devices. You'll notice some are Wi-Fi 6E devices, some are Wi-Fi 7. Obviously, the common theme with all of these devices is they're 6 gigahertz. So a bunch of different 6 gigahertz capable devices. One of the other things that I thought might be interesting to the folks is most of the talks that I've seen in the past really focus on, Android, iPhone, things like that, but not a lot on like the laptop side. So I wanted to kind of bring that into this and have this kind of holistic testing that looks across all the different types of devices and not just like a specific, operating system or a specific device. And that way we kind of compare things side by side. You might notice the little failed indicator there with the AX210. I was going to leave that out completely out of here, but I thought it was worth mentioning is I actually ran into some issues. I actually ended up kind of giving up on it because I couldn't get it working to the point of doing 6 gigahertz. Now we know obviously AX210s are used in all sorts of devices and work great in 6 gigahertz. In the laptop that I was using with the AX210, it wouldn't see 6 gigahertz. Same driver that I was using with the BE200 worked perfectly fine, actually worked really great on 6 gigahertz. I'd take an AX210, put it in there, it worked as a dual band client. So your mileage may vary. I guess the point why I wanted to kind of mention that in here is if you're looking at upgrading laptops and things like that, be aware that it's not going to always be that kind of seamless process. Obviously, if it's shipping with this type of technology in there, hopefully all those kind of things have been worked out. But yeah, if you're looking at potentially upgrading, that may be something to consider. Also, I wanted to note that as far as the drivers and the operating system that I used, I had everything up to date with the latest drivers, latest operating system at the time of the testing. So I just wanted to make sure this was in the presentation for anybody that might be reviewing this online, but know that this is all current technology that I was using for the testing. Also worth noting, all the testing was done with the devices left at their default configurations. Obviously, we know, especially like with Windows, there's a lot of different parameters you can change to make roaming more aggressive and things like that. I wanted to leave that factor out and just kind of do this testing based out of like the out-of-box experience without that kind of potential tuning that you could do to influence those results. So as far as the roaming testing going itself, you've got this manual method. This would obviously be very time-consuming, just to kind of see what this would look like. That's where it would be taking one device, moving back and forth between 2 or more access points, and then recording what the results are on there. Certainly possible, obviously fairly easy to set up, but very hard to be repeatable. So just to show you another way of what I'm kind of talking about there, in simulation, this is what we're talking about, right? We have 2 different access points, and I could take, in this case, I'm taking an iPhone that would be a 6 gigahertz capable iPhone, and we can try to see, okay, when is that client going to roam? Is it going to roam with these kind of parameters? You might run into an issue where you just can't get far enough away from that device. We can try a different device and see, do we see different behavior? does that client connect? In here we can see it connected on 2.4, so now we've got this kind of sticky client issue, and it's not going to roam over necessarily. But yeah, choosing different devices, we're going to see different behavior, different connections, depending on which system that we choose, which parameters we choose. So rather than me physically walking, getting all those nice steps in, which certainly I could use, but that wasn't going to be practical for this type of testing. So what I actually ended up with is this kind of automated testing method, which is using this ability to programmatically adjust the power levels of each access point. So I took two identical access points and I incrementally adjusted the power level on one AP to its max power while reducing the power on the other AP. And basically what we end up with is this repeatability that I could control and make it very repeatable for each of these devices, each of these tests. I also attempted to balance the RSSI across the bands as much as possible, so that way these devices, they would hear 2.45 and 6 gigahertz at the same, roughly the same RSSI level. So we could do some good testing with that. Each test was ran for 60 minutes, and then that accounts to about 20 the power adjustment cycles of each AP raising and lowering its power. Doing this testing, I was able to capture 1,000 plus roaming events between all these different devices, so I get a pretty good data set. And you can see that if you look in Aruba Central, quite a few power changes were recorded. I didn't realize that when I started this, that all those power changes I was making programmatically on the APs were all getting logged into Aruba Central. So I'm not sure if that set off any red flags or anything on their alerting system, but yeah, I thought that was interesting to see all those different changes. So to visualize that another way, compared to the other testing, this is what we're talking about, right? Putting a device essentially in the middle of these two access points, continuously raising and lowering the power on each AP to collect all this data. So let's get into the results. So the first test I wanted to run was kind of the baseline test of just, if all things are equal, do the clients prefer 6 gigahertz? So again, these are all tri-band clients, so they're all capable of 6 gigahertz, but if they're not given any incentive other than, is this a 2.4, other than is this, 6 gigahertz and I prefer that, all things were equal as much as I possibly could, where did they go? So I focused on two things here. So the first three there, the 2.45 and 6 gigahertz, that's the percentage of the time those devices roam to that band during this test. So all channel widths were at 20 megahertz. RSSI levels, like I said, were balanced as best as I could. Obviously, different devices hear different bands differently, but for the most part, pretty even across the board. The other thing to focus on is the number of roams. We could kind of equate those to like a really high roam count indicates that that client was kind of ping-ponging, right? It might bounce from one band to another band on the same AP or over to the other AP and then bounce back. So it was like kind of searching for something, multiple times. If we see a low roam count, that kind of indicates more of that sticky client issue that we experience, right? Where the client just doesn't want to roam or takes a long time to roam. So yeah, if you notice here, we've got two clients that kind of stand out. 100% of the time, an Intel B200 and a Windows laptop loves 6 gigahertz. All tests, very continuously. It roamed 15 times out of the 20 kind of, I would say, potential or kind of ideal. So it was a little bit sticky, but for the most part, all default settings actually does a pretty nice job. Same as the MacBook Pro, also notice 19 roams out of those 20. So a really nice job, roaming. The other clients, on the other hand, kind of all over the place. So that's our starting point, right? So then we can kind of adjust one parameter at a time and see how we influence those results. So the next thing is to look at, okay, do tri-band devices prefer wider channels? That's something that we've talked about. Wes presented about it in that presentation that I mentioned. So how do these clients actually choose which band where to roam to? So we've got these candidate scores on Android. You can see a bunch of different options there. But let's focus on one thing here is the score boost. And that has to do with a lot of calculating throughput is a big factor and a big weight into where it's going to go. So like I said, the first test, all things equal, it didn't have any incentive from a throughput standpoint to really move over to 5 or 6 gigahertz. Apple, very similar. You can see pretty much about the same amount of text there, right, of like all the different roaming decisions that it uses. But again, same kind of thing. Let's focus in on this part right here that I highlighted. It does have a band preference that's weighted on specifically channel width, and it will prefer 40s over 20s. It'll prefer 80s over 40s or 20s, and it'll even prefer 160 megahertz over 80, 40, or 120 or over 20. So if we look at the results of that, all I did on this test was I bumped the 6 gigahertz up to 80 megahertz, and look how drastically everything looks, right? So huge difference, making one change to the configuration. Everything else stayed the same, repeated the same exact test with the same power level adjustments. Look how beautiful that is. Almost every device, roaming roughly 20-ish times, everything preferring 6 gigahertz. So case closed, right? Still a lot of other options that we can consider, lots of other configurations. What happens when we bump up 5 gigahertz now to 40 megahertz? Because we know there is this kind of decision making that it looks at of if there's a wider channel, it has this preference. So what if it detects, maybe 5 gigahertz first and it sees, oh, that's a 40 megahertz channel. I'm going to prefer that over the 20 megahertz 2.4. And we do see some of that. The iPhone, if we flip back here, focus in on the iPhone 15. It went from being at, 88% to 6 gigahertz. By just bumping up the 5 gigahertz to 40 megahertz, we actually saw it start to shift over. What's most interesting to me, though, is it actually still went over to 2.4. Anybody see stuff like this with iPhone of doing some behavior that's kind of unexpected, doesn't really match the documentation, right? We know all this stuff is in the documentation that says it should do these certain things, but it still does kind of this unpredictable behavior. Also pay attention to these MediaTek adapters, particularly 7902. This is a very low end. Honestly, as far as I could find, this is like the lowest end Wi-Fi 6E capable chipset. It is a single spatial stream Wi-Fi 6E chipset, which I didn't know existed until I started doing this testing. So be aware there are some, you get what you pay for type of thing. So, obviously marketing's not going to focus on that. They're going to say, oh yeah, this is 6 gigahertz capable. It supports Wi-Fi 6E. All right, so dual band, 5 and 6 gigahertz only. We removed the 2.4 option in there, and now we can see some other changes. So I no longer, especially those mobile clients, the Pixel 8, the iPhone 15, no longer give them the option of going to 2.4. Look what happened to the iPhone. Instead of it going to 2.4 now and just to 6, it still is actually going to 5 gigahertz. So still some interesting behavior. Also notice the Pixel 8 loves to roam. A lot of like what I would consider kind of ping-ponging, looking at the logs, as it's kind of bouncing around quite a bit. All right, so using non-PSC. So this is an interesting one. So using non-PSC, does that impact roaming, especially obviously in the context of 6 gigahertz? Do we see a change in behavior? With the MediaTeks, absolutely. So there are some clients that we can see when we do the 6 gigahertz SSID on a non-PSC channel, especially when you start talking about roaming, these clients do struggle to find where to go on 6 gigahertz, and they start to go over to 5 gigahertz a lot more. So this is definitely something to consider, especially if you're going to be deploying like 40 megahertz on 6 gigahertz and you're doing non-PSC channels. It does potentially impact your roaming of your clients or these devices, depending on what these devices are doing and their algorithms of how they're detecting these. All right, this one was one that I was really interested in around 802.11k and if that improves roaming. This is always one of these things that, again, we talk about a lot. We talk about on the infrastructure side, and we talk about in the documentation of the devices, and we turn it on and nothing breaks. So we kind of hope that it's improving things, and maybe we see like some users aren't complaining as much. So we're like, all right, I did something. I don't know what it did, but it seems to be helping. I wanted to dig into that a little bit more and see what exactly is kind of happening from the device's perspective. So again, we'll look at kind of the iOS indications here. They have some really good documentation about what they do with 11K. And yeah, when 11K is enabled, it talks about specifically this helps the client roam by giving it the first 6 entries from that neighbor report to prioritize what channels it's going to be scanning. So it's going to be able to roam more quickly. It's going to be able to find these APs more quickly. It's going to make more intelligent decisions in its roaming. at least all in theory, right? Let's see what happens in the actual results. Again, same kind of thing where we did this test. We did it without 802.11k, and then we enabled 802.11k. Things look pretty good here, but let's break that down one step further and see side by side of a comparison of the same test ran between with 802.11k on and not. That's the only change in these tests. One thing I really loved about this testing that gave me at least confidence in my testing is look at how repeatable this test was across all these devices, where we saw very little to no difference on most devices, except for the one that I put in bold there, that iPhone 15, which was doing some very weird behavior early on in the testing without 11K, all of a sudden starts to look a lot better, in my opinion. One, it roamed way more frequently. The thing that stood out to me that was shocking was it went from roaming only 13 times during that test, was one of the fewest, to roam out of all the devices, to now roaming more than any other device in that same test. So huge impact of enabling 802.11k in your environments, especially if you're supporting iOS devices. And I would say for the positive, right? The client became much less sticky. It seemed to make much better roaming decisions because we see it significantly increased its percentage of times to roaming over to 6 gigahertz. Still hopped over to 2.4 a decent amount, so that would also be a consideration here of obviously turning off 2.4 and not giving it that option, as long as obviously the network's designed to be able to support that. All right. Let's talk about MLO. So because I had these nice Aruba 735 APs, I wanted to do some Wi-Fi 7 testing, at least a little bit, with the time that I had to kind of do all these tests. So I figured MLO and roaming would be an interesting one because I've gotten some questions about that, and yeah, I just didn't really have a good answer. So figured I've got some Wi-Fi 7 devices that do support MLO. I've got some APs that support MLO, so let's see what happens. So I was able to get some of these clients, Windows clients and Android clients, the Pixel 8 and some of the BE200 on the Windows laptop to connect using MLO. So we can kind of see that here, that they were actually having those MLO connections. So what does that mean from a roaming side of things, right? So no MLO versus MLO. So if we look at this, we can see we've got the Pixel 8, looked good without MLO. 100% of the time, actually, in that test, it roamed to 6 gigahertz. Roamed 24 times, not anything too crazy. But then notice what happened when I enabled MLO. It actually roamed to 6 gigahertz, definitely a lot less than 50% of the time. Still started actually roaming over to 5 gigahertz, but also noticed a lot fewer roams. And that's probably the biggest takeaway that I had out of this test, is with MLO enabled, we actually saw a much fewer number of roams for each of these Wi-Fi 7 capable devices with Wi-Fi MLO enabled. And looking at the logs and talking with some other folks, I think this makes a lot of sense, right? This is an interesting thought to be thinking about in your designs and just the device behavior, because now that client device is making 2 links on 2 different bands. Generally, it's going to be something like 6 gigahertz and 2.4 or 5 and 2.4. When we see that happening, it doesn't need to roam as frequently, right? Because it has that backup link that it can switch over to if, let's say, you walk behind, you're on 6 gigahertz and you walk behind something that quickly kind of lowers that RSSI, it doesn't have to panic roam. It can hang on to that same AP and just switch over to the 2.4 link. It moves past whatever that object is or whatever that anomaly that caused that signal to drop, and it doesn't have to panic roam as much. So I think that's what we're seeing in here based on the logs and the little bit of testing that I was able to do with this. What that means as far as your design consideration, yeah, I think it's something that we need to kind of talk through and look at. But yeah, I think it's a positive thing in the sense of the end user experience, right? But it is something that's brand new to us that we haven't had to think about or consider in our designs or our validations. Especially, yeah, the 2.4 side of it, right? Because generally we've kind of just written off 2.4, disable 2.4, things like that. Now we're kind of starting to bring 2.4 back of hey, maybe there's something we could do with this 2.4 to help our clients, roam and move through the network. Maybe that's not its primary connection, but maybe to make things a little more seamless for it, we can use that to our advantage. One more test that I did that I thought was pretty, interesting. I don't think it's all that great in the real world type of thing. What about Phil's discovery? So if you do a 6 gigahertz only network, I don't think most people would be doing it, but let's say you wanted to do 6 gigahertz only. Now this is not a 6 gigahertz only SSID. This is saying all I'm going to deploy on the access points themselves is 6 gigahertz. I'm going to turn off the 2.4 radio, the 5 gigahertz radio, which means there's no way to discover that 6 gigahertz radio other than using something like Phil's discovery, or obviously the client trying to scan all the 6 gigahertz channels to find those 6 gigahertz radios, which, you know, to connect to isn't that big of a deal, but how does it impact roaming? So pretty interesting results on the Phil side of things. So 6 gigahertz only on this AP, you can see, yeah, all these clients connected perfectly fine. There was no issues there. But look at how many times some of these clients roamed. Talk about a sticky client issue, right? Once these things connected to that 6 gigahertz only SSID, they really struggle to find where to go, even with Phil's being enabled, you know, for that discovery mechanism. All right, so let's kind of wrap this up a little bit as far as what do all these results mean when we're talking about 6 gigahertz design considerations. So I'm going to kind of break this down into 2 pages here because I think there's a lot of stuff to kind of consider. I think the given there is RSSI is still king, right? As far as our designs go, we still need to design for primary coverage, secondary coverage. But I think we need to at least be looking at things, you know, how do these devices actually hear 6 gigahertz? And actually make sure that we're designing for that appropriate RSSI on 6 gigahertz, right? Really, we shouldn't see much difference between 5 and 6 gigahertz, so I don't think that's a huge monumental like shift in our design methodology, but I think it's something at least just to be thinking about, that we're not just designing for 5 gigahertz anymore. Also the wider channel piece of it. You know, I feel like for so many years, we've been talking about like use narrower channels. Now with 6 gigahertz, you know, that whole mindset has shifted, right? So now we're talking, there's a lot of benefits to using wider channels. Using an 80 megahertz channel, I think is very practical in the US with 1200 megahertz or anywhere that you can use 1200 megahertz on the 6 gigahertz band. Obviously, there's extra consideration there as far as channel width in other parts of the world where you may only have 500 megahertz on the 6 gigahertz band. But the problem comes into the next point, which is use PSC channels when possible, as we saw with the MediaTeks. They can connect just fine on a non-PSC channel, but it does cause some issues when we talk about roaming. So yeah, we look at sometimes the stuff of like, oh yeah, that's tri-band capable. I turned it on, it connected to 6 gigahertz. All right, it's good to go. But we don't test the whole roaming and everything else. So stuff to consider with some of these devices, especially if you're getting some lower end Windows laptops, things like that, and you're not sure what chipsets are in there. Do some of this kind of validation, do some of this testing. Also a note that I put in there that I learned doing this testing, which is always interesting, doing these tests of all these kind of little like gotchas and stuff like that I hadn't really fully thought about, as I ran into this issue with the APs that I was using, where I can't configure a 40 megahertz channel on these APs I was using on a PSC channel. That was new to me. I didn't realize that was a thing. I figured that would work just fine and couldn't get it to work, and then reached out and found out, yeah, it actually has to be, if I'm deploying 40 megahertz channels on the 6 gigahertz radio, it has to be on a non-PSC channel in the sense of the management traffic, the primary channel, right? The wide channel would be on the PSC channel then in that case. But yeah, that's the implementation with this vendor. I don't know if that's true with other vendors, but that was what I found with this testing. So obviously 20 megahertz channels and 80 megahertz PSC is fine. If you do a 40, it's on a non-PSC channel, all your APs. So if you have clients that don't roam well with non-PSCs, that could be a big impact on your user experience. So again, if you're in the US, you can avoid all that by using 80 megahertz channels, and then there's no problem there. All right, the last set of conditions then, or considerations is avoid mixing channel widths. You know, we've talked about some of that kind of stuff. Oh yeah, if you got this conference room and you want some really high, some high throughput in that area, go ahead and crank that AP up to 80 megahertz, but we'll use 20s or 40s in the rest of the building. Well, based on the results that I showed there and from the testing, using wider channels on one AP and a narrower channel on another AP definitely could create some sticky client issues, right? Where a client's going to gravitate towards that AP. You're going to overload those APs with the wide channels. So unless those APs are like completely isolated from all the rest of the APs on different channel widths, I would be really careful with mixing channel widths in the same environment where those APs are audible, where the devices can hear both of those APs. Also consider disabling 2.4. Obviously, that's nothing new, but that can obviously help kind of steer those clients towards 5 or 6 gigahertz. And then enabling 11K, I talked about that pretty extensively. But yeah, also be aware some devices just prefer 6 gigahertz more than others. I was shocked by the MacBook and the B200. Those things were just, as far as if we're saying always roaming to 6 gigahertz is what we want, those things are rock stars. They basically ignored everything in those tests, and pretty much 100% of the time, those things just always went to 6 gigahertz. If they heard 6 gigahertz, they latched onto 6 gigahertz, they held on to that for the right amount of time, and then moved to another 6 gigahertz, just as we kind of would expect, right? And hope that really all clients, I think, would. But yeah, also avoid using Phil's discovery, use R&R, use those reduced neighbor reports. All you need to do is have at least a 2.4 or 5 gigahertz radio enabled for it to be able to send those R&R reports on. Even if it's on a different SSID, you can still do 6 gigahertz only SSIDs. That wouldn't have any bearing on this, but don't do a 6 gigahertz only radio on an AP. Otherwise, we won't get those R&Rs to help the client discover 6 gigahertz. Let's talk a little bit about the tools that I use to capture all this. So if anybody wants to repeat this kind of testing, there's some really good tools out there now to help us with this. On the iOS side, this tool was a huge help for me to do all this kind of testing. Ben Toner actually is the developer. He's here. And Oversight. This thing is awesome. You can install it right on your iPhone, right through the App Store. You can do live analysis of roaming. You can then write that information to a CSV, parse all the results. That's what I use to capture all the iOS roaming events. Then we also have an Oversight for macOS. This is really cool in the sense that not only can I use it to analyze the roaming on my MacBook, I can take those logs, the log information from the iPhone, and then I can pull it into an Oversight and analyze it, on the big screen as well. And then same kind of thing, you can record and play back those sessions, export it to text files, all that kind of stuff. So really good tools for roaming analysis on the iOS and macOS side. Windows, another developer that's here, Josh Schmezel. This is an awesome CLI-centric Wi-Fi scanning tool for Windows. This thing saved me so much time and effort doing this kind of testing and making this repeatable. My favorite feature of this, which might sound weird, is that all the logs I can stream to a remote syslog server. So I could just, set up the test, tell it to run for 60 minutes, stream all the roaming events from the Windows device to my syslog server, and just keep repeating the test and feeding all the results to a remote syslog. So I have all the stuff into a text file to parse. So yeah, LS Wi-Fi, awesome tool. Just great for just on the spot, on the Windows device live analysis as well, but really great for exporting those results, those roaming events. On the Android side, it's the good thing is no real third-party stuff is needed. This is kind of baked into the Android side. You can get access to tons and tons of information. Honestly, the biggest challenge with the Android side is there's just so much information that it provides, right? It gives you everything, and I had to sift through all that and try and figure out, what's the relevant info here for this kind of roaming. So yeah, those are the tools that I use to really help with it. Another one that's a worthy mention that we just announced on this, but I got a chance to use this a little bit during my testing, is this collaborative solution, we'll say. Hamina, Ossium, as well as Intuitabits partnered up, and we created this pretty slick Wi-Fi 7 capture solution using the Nomad device, which the Nomad, if you're not familiar with that, that's what Hamina uses as our Wi-Fi measurement device. But it's got 4 tri-band capable radios, even supports Wi-Fi 7. So we partnered up with Intuitabits to update AirTool to now support the Nomad as a capture device. So if you have a Mac and you have a Nomad, you can pick up AirTool too. I think it's like $30. And now you have an awesome multi-adapter, multi-channel capture solution. You can stream the PCAPs right into Wireshark for analysis, or save it to a PCAP file. So pretty slick solution. And then the last worthy mention here is if you just need to do some light roaming analysis, this is a great real-time roaming analysis method. Ubiquiti has this app called Wi-Fi Man. That's for Android and iOS, a little more limited on the iOS side, but this is a great just kind of on-the-spot troubleshooting tool that doesn't require any extra really effort or anything. So yeah, that's what I've got there. I've got about 30 seconds left. Let's see what I can do in 30 seconds here if we can get our Wi-Fi connected here. Get the walrus off the screen. But if we go into here, and I just noticed, actually, I thought I had 30 seconds left, but I'm actually over 30 seconds. So we're going to leave it at that. And if you do want to see any more of these kind of results, I did upload them to my GitHub repository. That'll take you there. So I obviously did a lot more testing, a lot more. I parsed it down to that. If you want to see more details and stuff on there, even these slides and everything are in there. I know I went through fast on a lot of those, but I had a lot to cover. Hopefully you guys got something good out of that, but we'll wrap it at that. Come see us at the evening event, and we can talk more about it. Thanks, guys.